It started with a message I almost ignored. The notification appeared while I was halfway through a tasteless dinner, scrolling without focus. A group chat I hadn't opened in weeks. The words were short: weekend at the house. You in? Followed by a handful of emojis and a quick clip of sunlight glancing off a lake. For a moment, I was ready to swipe it away. Work was stacked on my desk, laundry was in ruins, and I had no interest in locking myself into a nostalgia trip with people I hadn't seen in years. But my thumb paused above the screen. I told myself it was because I needed a break, a change of scenery, some excuse to step outside the loop I'd been living in for months. That was the version I could say out loud. The truth, one I hadn't fully admitted even to myself, was different. I wanted to see him. Not just anyone. Not a casual acquaintance or a forgotten school crush. Him. It had been years since we'd been in the same space. Sometimes his name would surface in someone else's story, or I'd catch him in the blurry background of a photo, half turned away, never the focus. Every time it happened, something sharp and quick would move through me, as if my chest had skipped a beat. I'd always brushed it aside. Now, staring at that message, I didn't want to. I typed, "Yeah, count me in." By Friday, I was on the road, windows cracked, music low, the air thick with the scent of earth and pine that pulled at old memories. Directions pinged in and out of service as I wound deeper into the hills until the signal vanished altogether. The lake house sat where it always had, past a curve in the road that felt like the edge of the gravel drive crunched under my tires, and there it was, the water stretched out in the distance, glassy under the fading afternoon. A couple of cars were already there. Laughter floated from somewhere unseen. I stepped out, and the air felt different, as if it knew I wasn't ready. I could have turned back. I could have avoided everything. The crowd, the small talk, the question. But the door opened before I could think too long. Gabriel, one of the old crew, called out, bounding down the steps. The hug was warm but quick, the kind people give when they're glad to see you, but not sure how much has changed. Others followed, faces I knew, voices I recognized, all pulling me into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. It should have been easy to sink into it, but my attention kept sliding elsewhere. Every laugh and greeting blurred in a background noise beneath one quiet, insistent question. Was he here? We carried bags, claimed rooms, swapped harmless jabs about who'd forgotten what. I moved through it all on autopilot, smiling when expected, nodding when someone spoke, but my focus drifted toward the lake, toward the sound of footsteps that weren't there yet. Then they were. I was hauling a box of drinks from the car when I heard movement along the side path. Unhurried, steady, the kind of walk that didn't need to announce itself. My body tightened before I even turned, and there he was. Time hadn't dimmed him. If anything, it had given him more gravity. Seeing him was like hearing a song I'd only listened to once, but somehow knew all the words. He smiled, small and careful, and said my name. Just my name, but it landed heavier than it should have. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, voice easy but eyes steady on mine. "I almost didn't come," I admitted. Something flickered across his face, maybe amusement, maybe recognition. "Glad you did." And then he passed me, heading toward the others, leaving behind a trace of something unspoken. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in fragments. Dinner on the deck, stories retold for the 5th time, the sun bleeding into the lake. Every time he spoke, my focus sharpened. Every laugh, even when not meant for me, seemed to find its way in. I'd spent years telling myself whatever I'd felt before was imagined, a product of timing or the tricks of memory. But here, surrounded by the smell of pine and the quiet lap of water against the dock, I wasn't so sure anymore. As the group drifted toward the fire pit, I stayed on the deck, leaning against the railing, eyes on the darkening. Their voices carried behind me, laughter, an easy rhythm I didn't join. The boards creaked softly. "You're quieter than I remember," he said. "Maybe I'm just out of practice," I answered. He stepped beside me, close enough that the space between us felt deliberate. For a while, neither of us spoke. The lake reflected the faint glow of the house lights, trembling with the breeze. "Some things don't change," he said at last. "Some do," I replied. He glanced at me, unreadable, but I felt it, the weight of a pause that meant more than silence. When I finally went inside, the room felt louder than it had before, the air warmer, the conversations more distant. "I come here for a weekend at the lake." That was the story I'd told. But I knew, even before the first night ended, that the real reason was standing beside me on the deck, and that whatever had started with a single message was only beginning. I'd been restless all morning, the kind of restless that makes every conversation feel like static. People were out on paddleboards, sprawled on towels, arguing over who could hold their balance long. I'd mumbled something about wanting to take the kayak out, and no one paid much attention. Good. I needed the quiet. I slipped the red kayak into the water and pushed away from the dock, feeling the slight wobble beneath me until I found a rhythm. Out here, the chatter faded, replaced by the slap of the paddle against the surface and the occasional bird call. The lake was wide and still, the kind of stillness that made you breathe slower without thinking. I wasn't heading anywhere in particular, just drifting toward the shadowed edges where the trees leaned in, blocking the wind. I must have glanced back toward the shore for a fraction too long, because the next moment the kayak tilted under me. My weight shifted the wrong way, and there was no time to correct it. Cold water surged up around me in a single, shocking wave. I went under hard, eyes squeezed shut, lungs pulling in air only after I'd broken the surface. My shoes felt like anchors, my shirt plastered heavy against my skin. I grabbed the side of the kayak and kicked toward the shallows until my feet scraped gravel. By the time I dragged myself onto the path, water was still streaming from my hair into my... That's when I saw him. He was leaning against the side porch railing, a coffee mug in one hand. He didn't laugh, didn't make a joke, just set the mug down, walked down the steps, and stopped in front of me. "Come on, let's get you warm," he said. The way he said it left no space for protest. He grabbed a towel from a bench by the door and held it out until I took it. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, rubbing the towel over my hair as if I could erase the moment entirely. "No one else is back yet," he added. "You'll freeze if you stand here." He turned toward the smaller guest house off to the side, and without thinking, I followed. Inside, the air was cooler than I expected, but carried a faint scent of wood and something sharper, like freshly brewed coffee. He pointed to a chair. "Sit." I did, still dripping, still trying to catch my breath. He disappeared into the back and returned with a folded set of clothes. They should fit well enough. I hesitated, mumbling something about being fine, but he just gave me a look that ended the argument. In the bathroom, I peeled off the wet layers and pulled on the dry ones. They were loose, soft, holding the faint warmth of someone else's. When I stepped back out, he was sitting on the couch, elbows on his knees, watching the empty fireplace. His gaze lifted to me. "Better." I nodded. The silence stretched, not awkward, but full. The kind of silence that makes you more aware of yourself. I said something about the kayak, about how it had happened, to fill the air. He smiled faintly. "Happens to everyone sooner or later." His voice was even, but there was a steadiness to it that made everything else in the room feel less sharp. I thanked him for the clothes. He shrugged it off. "You do the same for me." That made me pause because I wasn't sure I would have, at least not like this, not with the same calm care. For a while we sat without speaking. Outside, I could hear faint splashes from the dock, voices carrying in the wind, but they felt far away. He asked me if I'd been all right lately. It wasn't the casual kind of all right people use as a greeting. It was slower, deliberate, like he'd already guessed the... I could have lied. Instead, I said, "Mostly, not always." He nodded, as if that was the most honest thing I could have said. "Same here." It's strange how quickly a room can shrink when you're both being careful with your... The distance between our chairs felt smaller than it was. He leaned back slightly, studying me, not in a way that made me self-conscious, but like he was taking stock of someone he hadn't seen in years and wasn't sure how much had changed. "I remember you being quieter," he said finally. "You weren't wrong," I replied. He smiled at that, a small, almost private smile, and looked away toward the window. For a moment, I thought about asking him something I'd never dared to before, but the words stayed behind my... Instead, I let the quiet settle again. I noticed how he didn't push to fill it, how he seemed entirely comfortable letting the stillness breathe us. There was a kind of generosity in it, one I hadn't experienced in a long time. When the voices outside grew louder, signaling the group's return, he stood. "You should head back before they start wondering." I got to my feet, feeling reluctant to break whatever had been holding in the room. He held the door open, and as I stepped past him, I caught the faintest trace of his voice. "Glad you're here." I didn't answer, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't trust what my voice might give away. Out on the path, the late afternoon light hit the lake just right, scattering the surface with flashes of gold. The others were too busy with their games to notice me returning from the guest house. But I felt different. as though something small but irreversible had shifted. Later, when everyone gathered around the deck for food, I caught him looking my way once or twice. Not long stares, just quick glances, each one gone before I could decide what they meant. Every time it happened, the air seemed to thicken for a beat. When our eyes met by accident, we both looked away quickly, but the echo of it stayed. That night, I kept replaying the moment in the guest house. Not the words, but the way they'd been spoken. Not the clothes, but the gesture. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was something else, something quieter. And maybe that was why it mattered more. The next few days slid by in a way that made it hard to tell where one ended and the next began. Morning started early, with the sound of voices outside or the dull slap of water against the dock, and ended late, when the fire pit was just embers and the air had cooled enough to make you lean closer. Most of the time, we were surrounded by the others, laughing, moving in and out of shared activities, teasing each other over old memories. On the surface, it was simple, a group of people enjoying the quiet of the life. But beneath that, something else was happening, something I couldn't name without changing it. He wasn't always near me, but I was always aware of where he was. In the kitchen, rinsing a coffee cup. On the deck, leaning against the railing. Sitting at the edge of the dock in the late afternoon, watching the water. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes not, but the moments we did were never background conversation. They were small, contained exchanges, rare enough to matter more than they should. A comment about the weather. A question about whether I'd been getting enough sleep. A quiet laugh when I made a remark under my breath that no one else heard. It was never about the words themselves. It was about the attention, the deliberate way he listened, the space he gave for it. There were times I caught myself thinking about the difference between us, not just in years, but in the weight of experience. He carried himself like someone who had learned to stand still in the middle of noise, someone who didn't need to fill every gap with sound. That steadiness drew me in and pushed me back at the same time. It reminded me of what I didn't know, what I hadn't lived through yet. Sometimes that distance felt like a wall, other times like a kind of shelter. I'd see him talking with the others, and it struck me how easily he could slip into their rhythm, how natural it was for him to be part of the group without losing himself in it. I wondered if that was something you learned with age, or if it was just him. I wondered if I'd ever be able to do the same. And I wondered, more than I wanted to admit, what it would mean if I couldn't. One afternoon, I joined him by the dock while most of the others were out hiking. The lake was still, clouds moving slow overhead. He didn't look at me when I sat down next to him, just kept his gaze on the horizon. For a long time, we said nothing. Then he asked, "You like it here?" I said I did, maybe more than I expected. He nodded once, as though that was the answer he'd been expecting all along. We didn't push the conversation further, but when we stood to go back inside, I realized the silence had done more than words could have. Later that day, we crossed paths in the hallway. I stepped aside to let him pass, but instead of moving right away, he paused long enough for me to notice. There was no obvious reason, nothing anyone else would have thought twice about, but I felt it like a pulse under the surface. And then he walked on, leaving me with the sense that something had just been said without being spoken. At night, lying in bed, I thought about the way our conversation stayed balanced on that thin edge between casual and careful. I thought about how easy it would be to tip too far in either direction, to make the silence too heavy or the words too revealing. I thought about the way he looked at me sometimes, not with intensity, but with patience, like he was letting me decide whether I wanted to step closer or stay where I was. And I thought about how, even when I told myself to let it go, I didn't want to. The distance between us was real. It was in the years, in the different ways we'd lived, in the experiences we couldn't trade. But it was also in my own hesitation, in the questions I wasn't ready to answer. What exactly did I want from it? Was it just the safety of being understood, or was something riskier? Something that couldn't stay in this place without changing everything else? I didn't know, and maybe that was what made it harder. One evening, the two of us ended up in the kitchen while everyone else was outside. He was making tea. I was looking for a glass. It should have been nothing, but it wasn't. The way he moved aside from me without stepping away completely, the way our shoulders almost brushed when I reached past him, the way he handed me the glass before I'd even asked, it was nothing you could point to, but stayed with me. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important, but I kept hearing the way his tone shifted when he asked if I was enjoying the trip. It wasn't small talk. It was a check-in, quiet but intentional. I kept catching myself remembering these moments later, while I was reading on the deck, while I was walking back from the dock, while I was sitting by the fire with the others. I'd replay them, looking for something I'd missed, something that would explain why they felt like more than they should. And every time, I ended up with the same uneasy answer, because they were. By the last night, I'd given up trying to convince myself I wasn't just noticing him. I was looking for him. I was listening for the sound of his voice, for the way it could ground me in the middle of noise. And I was aware, painfully aware, of how easily this could all shift into something I couldn't take back. The difference in our lives, the way people might see it, the questions it would raise. I knew all of that, but knowing didn't stop me from wanting to close the space between. When I left the kitchen that night, I passed him at the doorway. He said my name, softly, as if to make sure I heard it. I stopped, and for a second, neither of us moved. Then he just said, "Sleep well," and walked past. It should have been nothing. It wasn't. And lying in bed afterward, I knew exactly why. Because I was no longer thinking about whether I wanted something. I was thinking about what it would mean if it happened on the third morning back in the city, when the lake already felt like something I dreamed. I was at my desk, pushing through emails, when my phone lit up with a notification from a friend who'd been at the lake. I almost ignored it. Another photo dumped from the weekend, probably, but the preview froze me. It wasn't a group shot. It was the two of us. We weren't even looking at the camera. I was crouched by the trail, one hand steadying the tire of his old truck while he leaned over, tightening a bolt. My head was tilted slightly toward him, his toward me. It was an unremarkable moment to anyone else. But to me, it felt like someone had cut open a sealed envelope and dropped the contents into a crowd. The caption was innocent enough, just a joke about fixing things on vacation. But the image carried something I wasn't sure everyone would miss. I clicked the comments. The usual teasing from friends, a couple of likes. Then one reply that made my pulse spike. "Didn't know you two were such a team." No emoji, no wink. Just words. I told myself it was harmless. Still, my mind was already racing ahead, imagining what could happen if the wrong person started asking the right question. By that evening, another friend had messaged me directly. "So you and him? What's that about?" It was casual, but I could feel the curiosity beneath. I typed back something vague about helping with the truck, keeping my tone light, pretending I didn't understand the subtext. They didn't press, but the seed was planted. A day later, I got a message from him. Short. Saw the post. "You okay?" I stared at it for a long time before replying. "Yeah, just didn't expect it." He called instead of texting back. His voice was steady, but I could tell he'd been thinking about it. "It doesn't look like anything," he said. "Not unless someone's looking for something." That was the problem. I wasn't sure if people had started looking. We didn't speak for a moment, the line quiet except for the faint sound of traffic. "It's not proof," he added. "And even if it were, we haven't done anything to be ashamed." I knew he meant it, but the reality outside our conversations felt sharper. People didn't always care about the truth. They cared about the story they thought they saw. When we hung up, I told myself to let it go. Then, the following weekend, it got harder to pretend. I met up with some of the same friends from we were at a bar, the noise making it easy to dodge certain topics. For the first hour, no one mentioned the photo. Then one of them leaned across the table, voice low. "Seriously though, what's going on with you two?" I laughed it off, but they didn't. "It's just, I've never seen him look at anyone like that. Not even back then." The words landed heavier than I expected. Back then was his past, not mine. And yet, here I was being pulled into it. I said something about reading too much into nothing, and the conversation drifted. But the way they'd said it stuck with me. They'd noticed something I hadn't realized was visible from the outside. A few days later, he and I crossed paths again. I didn't mention the bar, but he must have sensed something. We were walking back to his car after grabbing coffee, and he said, "They're going to talk no matter what. We can't control that." I nodded, though part of me wanted to argue. "You worried?" he asked. I thought about lying. Instead, I said, "I'm not sure yet." That night, another message came, this time from someone I'd known for years but hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey, random question, are you seeing him?" No lead in, no context, just the question. I typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, I replied, "Not in the way you think." It was the truth, but not the whole truth. The shift was subtle after that, but it was there. In the way friends' eyes lingered a second too long when we were in the same room. In the pauses before certain questions. In the way group conversations seemed to bend slightly around us, as though people were trying to see the outline of something without looking straight at it. One evening, we ended up at a small get-together hosted by someone from the crew. It was crowded enough that no one stood out except him. I noticed the glances, the unspoken exchanges between people who'd been there that we... At one point, someone near me said, "You two got pretty close up there, huh?" I met their eyes, weighing my response. "Yeah," I said, and left it at that. Later, he found me in the kitchen, away from the... "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though the truth was complicated. "It's not the questions I mind," I admitted. "It's not knowing how to answer them without giving away more than I want." He leaned against the counter, watching me for a long moment. "Then maybe the answer is just, we enjoy each other's company. It's true, and it's enough." I wanted to believe that. Maybe I did. But I also knew that people rarely stopped at me. The night ended without incident, but the undercurrent was impossible to ignore. We left together, walking in silence until we reached the corner where our paths split. He paused, looked like he was going to say something, then just nodded and turned away. In the days that followed, I noticed something unexpected. The people who seemed most curious weren't hostile. If anything, there was a kind of quiet acceptance in their questions, even when they didn't phrase them. They weren't looking for a scandal. They were trying to understand something that didn't fit into their usual categories. That didn't make it easy, but made it less threatening. One afternoon, a friend from the lake called me out of the blue. "I don't know what's going on," they said, "but you seem different. Happier." I didn't confirm anything, but I didn't deny it either. "Maybe I am," I said, and that was enough for them. It was strange. The thing I'd been sure would turn into suspicion or gossip was turning into something else, something slower, less sharp. The questions didn't stop, but they softened. And in their place, there was space. Space to breathe, to think, to decide what I wanted without the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down at once. When I saw him again a week later, I told him about the call. "They're noticing," I said. "And?" he asked. I thought about it, then shrugged. "And maybe that's not the worst thing." He smiled. Not wide, just enough to show he understood. "Exactly," he said. And for the first time since the photo, I felt the knot in my chest loose. The secret wasn't gone, not completely. It was still ours, still unspoken in the ways that mattered. But it wasn't sitting on the edge of disaster anymore. It was balanced somewhere between visible and invisible, in a place where for now, it could stay. It was late autumn when I drove back to the lake. The trees had turned, their branches holding fire in the form of leaves that looked ready to let go. The road felt different than in summer, quieter, but still threaded with the same turns I knew from memory. I hadn't been back since that weekend, not in person. We'd talked, calls late at night, messages scattered through the weeks, but distance had a way of making me second-guess the edges of what we were. This trip was different. It wasn't a group gathering. It was just me coming back. The gravel crunched under the tires as I pulled into the drive. The porch light was already on. Before I could knock, the door opened. He was there, framed by the light behind him. "You made good time," he said. I told him I'd left as soon as the last meeting ended. He stepped back to let me in, and the air inside was warmer than I'd expected. We didn't rush into conversation. Instead, we sat for a while in the main room, the faint crackle from the fireplace the only sound. He asked if I wanted tea. I nodded. When he came back, he handed me the mug and took his own seat across from me. For a long moment, we just sat there, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full of everything that doesn't need to be spoken. I thought about all the times over the past months when I'd wondered if this would still feel the same. If the distance, the questions, the near miss of being exposed had changed something in ways we couldn't fix. Sitting there, watching the light from the fire catch in small, shifting patterns, I knew the answer. It hadn't. We talked eventually, not about the past or the what-ifs, but about ordinary things. How the season had changed the lake, what he'd been working on lately, the walk he liked to take in the mornings before anyone else was. I told him about the calls I'd taken, the projects that had stretched longer than expected. None of it was remarkable, but none of it needed to be. At some point, the conversation fell away again. The silence this time felt different than it had months ago. Back then, I'd filled it with questions in my head, try to read every shift in tone, every glance. Now I just let it be. I realized that this was part of what made it work, that we didn't need to push the moment into something louder to know what it meant. He leaned back slightly, looking toward the fire. "It's good to have you here," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried more than any long explanation could have. I didn't rush to answer. When I did, it was just, "It's good to be here." That was enough. Later, after we'd cleared the mugs and added another log to the fire, he asked if I wanted to walk down to the dock. The air outside was sharp with the kind of cold that wakes you up completely, but we went anyway. The lake was darker now, the surface smooth except for the occasional ripple. We stood there without speaking, watching the faint outline of the far shore. I thought about the last time we'd been out here together, months ago, when every step felt like it could lead to something neither of us was. Now, there was no tension in the space between us, only something steadier. He glanced over at me, and in that look there was understanding. Not the kind that comes from agreement, but from acceptance of what this was, what it wasn't, and what it could be without forcing it. When we headed back up the path, our shoulders brushed once. Neither of us moved away. Back inside, the fire had settled into a deep glow. We sat again, this time on the same side of the hearth. The warmth from it reached just far enough to make the room feel smaller, contained. He spoke once more, quietly. We don't have to define it right now. I met his eyes for a moment before looking back at the fire. I know. We stayed like that until the logs burned down to end. No more questions. No more careful balancing between what could be said and what shouldn't. Just the presence of someone you didn't have to guard yourself against. When I finally went to bed, I didn't replay the day in my head, trying to find meaning in every word or gesture. I didn't need to. The meaning was already there, in the ease of the evening, in the simple fact that I was here again by choice, and so was he. The next morning, we had breakfast without hurry. There was no plan for the day, no list of things to fit in before I left. It wasn't about doing anything. It was about being in the same place, without the weight of wondering whether we... Before I got in the car to leave, we stood for a moment at the edge of the drive. He said, "You'll come back?" It wasn't a question loaded with doubt, just a straightforward ask. "Yes," I said, and meant it. Driving away, I realized that nothing about this had been resolved in the way people usually mean when they talk about resolution. There were still unknowns, still decisions ahead. But the need to have everything mapped out had fallen away. Sometimes the most important acceptance isn't about clarity. It's about knowing that the space between two people doesn't have to be filled with explanations. And as the road curved away from the lake, I knew that was enough.